Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to our webinar, Tips for Conducting Virtual Title IX Interviews. I'm Adrienne Mathis, Program Director here at Title IX Solutions. As you may know, or you're familiar with, we're in Zoom webinar, which means all of you are muted and your cameras are off. If you have any technical issues, feel free to drop them in the chat box. I will be participating in the webinar, so I'll try to get to you as soon as possible if I can help you. This webinar is only 30 minutes, so we might not have time for a Q&A session. That being said, if you do have any questions for Tom, for Pat, for myself, please email me directly. I'll put my email in the chat box as well. We'll get back to you as soon as possible. As we mentioned, after this webinar, we will send you a PDF document of our virtual Title IX guidelines and checklist. So be on the lookout for that in your inbox within the next day. We'll also upload a recording of this webinar to our website. So when I send you the email tomorrow with the PDF, I'll also include the link to our website. I'll also drop it in the chat box. If you want to watch it again, please feel free to do so. If you want to share it with your colleagues, please feel free to do so. Finally, if you would like a certification for attending this, or a certificate or whatever you may need to show your supervisor that you attended a half-hour webinar, please email me directly. We're happy to help you with that. No problem. I think that's it for housekeeping. I'll go ahead and turn it over to Pat.
Thank you, Adrienne, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. My name is Pat Mathis. I am the managing member for Title IX Solutions, or TICSIS, as we sometimes call it. I am also a co-founder with my friend and business partner, Tom Denton. I am an attorney by background and profession, and perhaps most salient to today's audience and our program, I have been a trustee at a liberal arts college in the Midwest for over 12 years. So I have some understanding and appreciation of higher education and the challenges that higher education faces from an internal perspective. And I appreciate and understand how difficult these last few months and the next few months have been and will be for many of you. So we particularly appreciate you taking the time to join us today. As I mentioned, Tom and I have been friends for a long time, and a couple of years ago, I'd just like to give you a little background on our organization and what we do, and I thought I would tell you just how we got here briefly. As a trustee, I had some involvement with presentations on campus on Title IX and Title IX investigations. And I found it interesting, began to talk with Tom a bit about it. And I was more focused on the legal and higher ed side, while Tom was more focused on the practical aspects of the investigations. Ultimately, as we continued these conversations, we came to appreciate that there was an apparent need in some situations for colleges to have independent, professional, and experienced outside investigators available to assist them in situations where campus-based investigators may not have been the best fit for those situations. So we recruited, vetted, and organized a group of former FBI agents who serve as investigators for our organization, Title IX Solutions. We offered training to those former FBI agents in Title IX, trauma-informed investigative techniques, empathy-based investigations, gender-biased. And at this point, we have licensed professional investigators in 26 states who provide services to our college clients conducting Title IX investigations. We also serve as consultants to a number of schools, and we are available to provide consulting services to Title IX coordinators and campus-based investigators for situations and cases that they may be involved with and want some outside advice. And that is an ongoing project for us with a number of schools. We provide training to campus-based investigators, both on an individual school basis as well as on a regional basis where it's offered to multiple schools at the same time. And we also provide services to U.S. and international universities as it relates to sexual misconduct policies, protocols, and investigations, and particularly the interrelationship between their U.S. schools and their international counterparts as it may relate to sexual misconduct, sexual assaults that might affect U.S. students while studying abroad. And lastly, with the recent Title IX regulations being introduced last week, we are working with a number of schools in assisting them with updating their Title IX policies, sexual misconduct policies, to conform to the new regulatory requirements. And we appreciate that in light of the mid-August deadline for bringing those changes into effect, and the challenges that every school in the United States is facing today, that we can be of assistance to many schools in handling that aspect of their updating while they're focused on the other challenges that are affecting all of you. So we appreciate you being here today. We are always available to answer questions about our services, or maybe a question that you just have about a Title IX matter that we can be of assistance. Feel free to visit our website anytime or reach out to either Tom or Adrian or myself. Thank you again for joining us. And I'm going to turn it over to Adrian and Tom to talk about virtual Title IX investigations. Adrian?
Great. Thanks so much, Pat. Let's get started, Tom.
All right.
So in general, what have you learned about conducting interviews over the past 40 years that you'd like to share with us today?
Well, first and foremost, an interview is not a science, it's an art. And like anything else, the more you practice it, the more proficient you can become in it. That's not to say that there is not a lot of scientific research into certain aspects that you will encounter as you conduct your interviews, such as the neurobiology of trauma and how that might affect the way someone responds to you. But overall, it's an art, and the more you do it, the better and more proficient you will become at it. I can't teach everything I've learned over the course of my career in one 30-minute segment, but the goal of this webinar is to help you feel more comfortable with Title IX interviews and get over some of the challenges that are associated with conducting interviews virtually.
What would you say are your top tips for Title IX interviews?
I'd like to say that first and foremost, follow your school's policy, as well as the newly released Title IX guidelines to avoid an adverse outcome. If you don't clearly adhere to your own school's policy, it creates an adverse thing for the record that could be quite challenging to deal with at a later time. Due process for all parties in a Title IX investigation is critical. Number two, I'd like to say that emphasize the importance of building rapport. By that I mean, first, slow down and take your time and get to know who you're interviewing. Make somewhat of a personal connection. Realizing that all of us form an opinion of people we encounter, just as you have already in the first 10 seconds or 15 seconds of seeing me on this virtual webinar. You're formulating opinions about the other person. And just as soon as you enter an interview room, or you dial in on a platform such as Zoom and conduct an interview, that person is looking into your eyes, he's looking into your face, he's looking at body language, all the same things that you will be doing as a part of your interview. So be mindful of that. Try to avoid reacting to questions or the answers to questions. Just kind of be aware that that person is trying to, and oftentimes that person is traumatized. They're looking for a friendly face, and hopefully you can provide that. It just makes for a more conducive environment to conduct an interview. But go slow, take your time, get to know the person. When you are doing that, just ask generic questions. Most of these folks will be college students, of course, and you might just simply ask about show an interest in their course of study and what year and training they're in. Are they involved in sports or other extracurricular activities? A little bit about their family, whatever they want to share with you, because you're starting the process of being able to ask questions and receive an answer. Be a good listener, be patient, persistent, and display empathy. Treat others as you would want to be treated in a similar circumstance, be it a respondent or a complainant. This is their life is at that moment upside down, and you are in a special position. I can't overemphasize the importance of an interview to get to the facts for the ultimate deciders of the matter, and that would be the disciplinary board or whatever tribunal your particular school has. So it's an important part that you play. I hope that that you are able to gather as much information through the course of this interview. It's important to keep an open mind. I like to tell the person I'm about to interview that as a setup to the interview itself is that there will be no right or wrong answers. The purpose of the interview for today is to hear your account for the record of what happened in a particular incident. I want to also distinguish between interview and interrogation. And the reason I want to do that, there's some confusion even in law enforcement circles about what's the difference. I define the difference between an interview and an interrogation as this. An interview is simply a planned conversation. An interrogation is a planned conversation, but it's designed to overcome resistance to truthful answers. You want to avoid, as a Title IX investigator, for a number of reasons, being tempted to go into an interrogation. One, it exceeds your authority, and if you aren't really familiar with conducting these kinds of interrogations, you can get really jammed up, and there's no reason for it. Your role at this point is to simply gather the facts. I prefer to work in teams of two, preferably when you have the luxury, mixed gender. And the reason I like to do that is so that I'm not in a one-on-one situation and that the other person is trying to get out of a bad situation, and they will turn it on you that you did this or you did that. So you want another independent witness. I like to work in teams of two. I like to be the lead investigator, the lead interviewer when appropriate, and I like to have the second interviewer there out of eye shot, out of line of sight of the person being interviewed so that there's no distraction, and let that person take the notes that are important to an interview. I find note taking while I'm trying to interview to be a distraction, and it triggers certain responses from the person that's being interviewed. For an example, they may think to themselves, why did he find that interesting about what I just said? Why did he write that down? What's he going to do with that information? How is that going to affect me in a negative way? So to get around that, I would simply work in teams of two, have the second investigator take care of the housekeeping and note taking, and ultimately there will be points where you can circle back and you'll give that other investigator an opportunity to ask a question, or he can give it to me for clarification. That's the way I like to do it, and why.
What are your thoughts about virtual Title IX interviews in this new normal we're living through?
I always would prefer an in-person interview. I have conducted a lot of phone interviews, for an example, and those are recorded as well. And you can do that for lesser witnesses, if I could use that term, people that might have some knowledge of an incident but don't really know a lot. You can knock those out with a phone interview. I do recommend that you record them like all others, with the permission of the person you're interviewing. But in the ideal world, I would always prefer and opt for in-person interviews. In light of the coronavirus pandemic that we're causing us to isolate right now, that may not be an option. So there is a way to do it and get comfortable in doing a virtual interview. We'll go over a couple of the more specifics, but the thing that you can do just as though you were there in a virtual interview is you're able to read the body language that I mentioned earlier, the eye contact, the facial expressions, the hand gestures, the breathing, which direction their eyes are going. You'll be able to start picking up and reading on those things as you develop your skills as an interview. Also be cognizant to listen to their needs. You're reading that person the entire time. You watch how they answer the question. If they start fidgeting around, make a mental note of it. And if necessary, just ask them, are you uncomfortable? Is there something that I can help you with here, even though you're at a distance?
So, Tom, one of the issues associated with virtual interviews is, as the investigator, you tend to lose a lot of control of the setting. So how do you suggest we deal with this?
You can regain some of that in advance, particularly when you, I've been asked before, do you prefer to interview somebody cold, just show up and start an interview? No, I don't. I like to arrange for that interview and go over the expectations of the interview and what they might expect during the course of an interview. Then that gives you the perfect opportunity to say, in a virtual setting, they want to select a place that is safe, that is comfortable, that's private with no distractions. So select a comfortable room or corner of a room where you have some privacy and be as comfortable as possible. Be mindful of seating, get a chair that's comfortable. A typical interview is going to run between 1 and 2 hours. And so you don't want, out of physical discomfort, the interview to be cut short. So just mention the fact that they want to get whatever it takes to make them comfortable as you do it. You might mention also you're dealing with emotional issues. There's many triggers as you ask questions that can prompt a response. You might want to suggest they have tissues, for an example. Oftentimes tears will flow in these kinds of interviews. A bottle of water, because a lot of people get dry mouth when they're under stress, or doesn't mean they're lying, but just have a bottle of water available and be able to provide for their physical needs if they need to go to the restroom or whatever. The other thing it's important to do in the initial setup is maintain control of all parties that will be in a room. Under the Title IX guidelines, you're a respondent and a complainant are entitled under the law to have an advocate or an attorney of their choosing present with them. And that's okay, but you don't want to lose control of the interview. So I like to set that up in advance so there's no misunderstanding about it. I also think it's important that you know by asking who all is present when you're doing a virtual interview. Simply ask that question for the record. Is there anyone else with you today? And it's a possibility the entire football team's just right out of sight of the camera. You need to know that because you may be asked who else was present, and you need to be able to truthfully say what you know about it. The thing I like about Zoom or the other platforms is that it gives you an opportunity to invite people and let them into that virtual setting. So those are some of the ways you can work around a virtual interview as opposed to an in-person interview, but all the principles are still the same.
Do you have recommendations for us about how to question complainants and respondents during an interview?
I do. Be comfortable and calm, and they will play off of that demeanor. If you're uptight, that just kind of spills over to the other person. They kind of react to you in that way. Be sure to ask open-ended questions. A lot of times I'm asked, well, what's an example of an open-ended question? Well, you want to avoid yes or no questions. Rather than say, were you in your dorm room on this night at such and such a time, and expect them to say yes. Rather say, where were you about whatever date you're looking at, and what can you tell me that happened then, in their own words. So keep it open, and you do that to maximize the amount of information they give you. The more information that they give that's forthcoming, the better picture you have of concluding the facts of what really happened in this particular complaint. It maximizes, asking open-ended questions will maximize that flow of information. That also gives you a wonderful opportunity for follow-ups, things maybe you didn't anticipate. You learn new information, and you can play off of that to get a better picture of what happened. Allow plenty of time for your interviews. Again, I mentioned that normal interview, you can expect to take it between an hour and 2 hours. Anything beyond 2 hours is getting pretty long. You might want to reschedule for a follow-up rather than wear everybody down. Just be mindful of that other person's needs. Proceed slowly within that time slot. And make sure that you're hearing what the other person is saying. Be careful not to accuse, even if you catch somebody in a lie or what you believe is an untruth. Don't tip your hand that you think that. There's an opportunity, and I'll tell you how to deal with it here in a minute. But don't tip your hand as the fact you're maybe not believing something that they're saying. Just take it down. Now, what you can do at that moment is say, I'm a little confused about that. Can you clean that up a little bit, or ask another question about it in their own words? And simply choosing a different way of saying the same thing can convey to you a different result.
So, kind of expanding upon that a little bit, if we do notice inconsistencies in a respondent or a complainant's account, what should we do? What do we say? Do you have any more examples for us?
Well, yeah, I would say remember your purpose in being there. It's to get as much information for the triers of these circumstances, the disciplinary board or the Title IX coordinator, as possible. You can change the way you ask questions, and you can. I'm sorry, going back to what you had just said was, what was your exact question?
If you have just some examples about how to deal with any inconsistencies during an interview, or.
Right. Be mindful of the record, and feel free to circle back at some point. You may want to bypass one particular question that seems to be stalling the interview, and wait for later, because there'll be a time that I'll describe to you later on in the interview. So just take your time and keep the flow going, and keep the answers coming.
We briefly touched on this before, but some respondents and complainants will have an advisor or attorney or advocate present with them. How should we navigate that situation?
You should welcome them, especially in a sexual assault. An advocate is there to help the victim of the assault, and that helps. They're looking for trust. And again, I've explained to you how you develop that trust. You're a friendly face, but you have to earn that respect, and you earn that respect by treating others the way you would want to be treated in exactly the same situation. And from that, it's a framework for you to work and build and develop, again, on the rapport that we mentioned earlier, that makes it safe to trust. On a respondent, for an example, an attorney is welcome. Everyone, this is a fair process. You should be impartial. It's required of you under the Title IX guidelines, and I'm sure under your school policy, for you to be fair, unbiased, impartial. So welcome them. Now, I would say this about other people present in the interview. This is your interview. You're the professional. You need to control the situation. If you're not used to interviewing folks that are represented by an attorney with the attorney present, it can be somewhat intimidating, but there's no reason for it. You welcome them there, let them know that they're an important part of this process, but you do set out the parameters on how your interview is going to proceed. So, for an example, you do not want to allow for an advocate, a friend, or an attorney to take control of your interview. And you simply say that this is the way we're going to proceed. If you have a question that you would like ask that. I'll allow you the time. Ask that of your client, and let that client ask me. If they don't follow those rules, you terminate the interview because you've lost control of it. And it's important that you keep this going in a methodical fashion without interruption. Sometimes that's a strategy, most times not. But just maintain control. You're in charge of this particular moment, and it needs to be done within your confines. You spell those rules out in advance, and that's the way you proceed. If you do not get cooperation, say you have an aggressive attorney that's challenging every question that you ask, terminate the interview. That's my advice.
Let's talk about recording the interview for a moment. What do we need to know?
I recommend always recording the interview because the laws vary state to state, and in a virtual setting, you don't know which law is going to kick in. So just to avoid those kinds of issues, I think it's important to get on the record that this person has consented to a recorded interview of his private oral communication. Some states are very strict on that matter, so just avoid it. Tell them that I recommend when you're building a recorded record that you put on the record right at the start what I call a preamble that simply says today's date is such and such a date and such a time. Identify yourself and your role for being present in this interview and the parties that are present that you're aware of. Another little tip, that during your preamble, you want to include the location of the interview for later, and also get a voice sample of all the persons present. You heard me say maybe the football team is over here on the side and you can't hear them. Well, now's the time to find out, and you need to get their consent to be a party to this recording as well. And so you just simply say that, and give me a voice sample. I need a voice sample if someone is out of sight of an attorney, whoever is out of sight of the person you're interviewing for whatever reason. Ultimately, when you're done, that video or audio recording will be transcribed, and the transcriptionist wasn't there, so they don't know who's necessarily talking, or someone may talk over the other. So to help them, you want to get a sample of the voice. And so at the very start of it, the preamble say, for the record, could you state your name? They'll state their name. And are you aware that this conversation is being recorded? And they will say, yes, I am. Is that recording being done with your permission? And they will say, yes, it is. If they say, no, it is not, you stop the interview. Don't be tempted to get drawn into terms other than your own on how to conduct these interviews. Later, at the end of the recording, there will be an add-on at the bottom of your preamble, and that's how you close out, identifying date, time, all persons still present, being present in the room. If someone exits the room or signs off for whatever reason, it needs to be noted in the record that the tribunal or the disciplinary board, the Title IX coordinator will be able to see and understand. It's your responsibility to keep on track of who's where. But at the end of it, you just simply close it off with a date and time, and that all persons that were present for the interview are still present, and that concludes this interview.
So let's say that you've gone through all the questions that you've had during your interview. How do you wrap it up? Before closing the recording, how do you wrap it up?
I think it's very important for to make sure everyone has had an opportunity to be heard. Again, putting yourself in that person's situation, you don't want them going away saying, well, he didn't ask me this, or I didn't get to say that. So this is a good opportunity at the close to say, is there anything else you would like to add for the record? And is there anything that I failed to ask that I should have? Then I will also turn to the other investigator who's been taking notes during the course of the interview and ask if there's anything they would like to ask, and allow them that time to do it. But you start to bring it to a close. And with that, you deactivate the recording device, and I try to exchange contact information. I give a business card, find out best contact for the person you're interviewing in case you need to come back. You may, after interviewing in your investigation other persons, there may be something that's relevant that you didn't know about that you would like to ask the person about. So you may need to bring them in for a subsequent interview. Note any requested action items. It's very important. If during the course of the interview, the person being interviewed says, well, I would like to know about this or that, can you get back to me with that? If you told them you would, you need to make a note of it and follow through.
So let's say you've completed the interview, asked everything you need to ask, turned off the recorder, left the room. Now what do we do?
Take that recording and preserve a exact, true, an actual recording that's your first. You used to do it a different way than you do it now, but you need to have an original recording. From that original recording, you need to be able to make duplicates for first the transcriptionist and allow them to get started on their work so that you have a written record. But it's also good for you to work from a copy for yourself, because I will be writing a report of that interview. Report of the interview, you say, well, that's somewhat redundant. Well, it is, but remember that the way the following processes will work, people will be reviewing that, and not everybody has the time to sit and watch line by line a 2-hour interview. So you have that transcribed. That gives you an opportunity to go back and review that actual video or audio recording with the benefit of the transcription. And you note that I've generated that report. It's there that you will chronicle the flow of the interview. And the way you do it is to simply say, during the course of this interview, the person that was interviewed stated essentially the following. You kind of track along with the high points of what was said during the interview. Then you make a reference of that report into your final report that brings in all the witnesses, interviews, and everything else together. If you had detected earlier deception or something you couldn't reconcile in your own mind, in that report of interview is the place to put that. You can simply say, the person I interviewed said this, however, that doesn't seem to be possible, or it doesn't line up with what someone else has said. And I could not determine which way it was. You're unable to resolve that conflict, and you put that in your report without further opinion on that report of interview. There is some wiggle room to provide some opinion. You've got to be careful with that in your final report to the Title IX coordinator.
Well, great, Tom. Thank you. We're at 1:37, so that's all the time we have today. I'm sure we still have some questions for you, and you have more wisdom to impart. But for today, that's all the time we have. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much.
And Pat, do you have any final things before we log off?
I would just like to thank everyone for attending today. We appreciate your time and attention. And I would also like to note that we are planning a follow-up webinar on the new Title IX regulations and particularly how they affect investigations and the new requirements for the procedural aspects of the investigation and hearing process. And that is scheduled for May the 27th. We will be sending out an email on that. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you. And be on the lookout for a follow-up email from me with the PDF of guidelines and the checklist. And email me directly if you need a certificate of completion of this half-hour webinar. Thank you so much.